So my name is Michael Castillo, Associate Editor at Forbes. It is officially 2 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and kick this off. And I'm really grateful to Hyperledger for giving us this space to chit-chat with 3 of our 50 Blockchain 50 list members, or as they like to call it at Forbes, listers. So if you hear me call you a lister, that's a little bit of the Forbes lingo coming in. And for those of you who don't know what the Blockchain 50 is, this is our 2nd year doing it, and we thought that there was an opportunity to shine a light on some of the non-cryptocurrency applications of blockchain. I think that because the cryptocurrency application of blockchain lets so many people actually own that asset, it's a recipe for great clicks in the media. Everyone who has Bitcoin clicks on the Bitcoin story. Everyone who has Ethereum clicks on the Ethereum story, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the result of that is that many news organizations don't give non-cryptocurrency applications of blockchain the attention that we think they deserve. And so we decided to prioritize the storytelling and the research and the use cases above getting big clicks on articles. And I think it's really, really paid off. This is our 2nd year with the Blockchain 50 list. The criteria to get on are relatively simple to say and very, very difficult to do. So you have to be valued at $1 billion or more, you have to manage $1 billion worth of assets, or you have to be generating $1 billion worth of revenue a year. And you have to be doing meaningful applications of blockchain. Meaningful applications of blockchain is deliberately ambiguous because newer companies to the space, a meaningful project can be relatively simple. The longer that you've been around, the higher the bar becomes for what we consider a meaningful application. So for companies that have been around from the very beginning, we're going to be asking really concrete questions like, what are your transaction volumes? How many live applications do you have? Who are your users? And for newer companies, we might ask more simple questions like, how big is your team? What is your budget? How many proofs of concept do you have, et cetera. We brought on a team of, depending on who you count, 13 reporters and editors to go through the nominations, which came from the public, as well as our own internal sources. So, like, for example, some companies may not want the publicity. They may not self-nominate. They may not come to us, but we know they're doing really cool stuff, and they're still candidates to be on the list. After our team reached out to all the nominees and all the other candidates, we methodically went through, we looked at transaction volumes, we looked at live applications, we looked at team size, and after we got all the data that we could together, really did kind of make a little bit of a gut call. Who do we think are the 50 most important companies in the blockchain space this year? And these 3 are 3 that made it. I'm, again, just very glad that you guys were able to come. In the interest of being really clear about what you have done and who you are, I'd like to ask if we could just go down the panel really quick and introduce yourselves. And if you would pick a blockchain application that you're particularly proud of, that you think kind of demonstrates what your company is doing. If you've got 1,000 of them, I don't want to try and cover all of that here. I'd rather try and speak in a little bit more concrete terms. And then we'll kind of improvise from there. I do think we have an opportunity to open it up to the audience to ask questions, and we'll keep it informal. Feel free to ask each other questions. If you have a question you want to ask in the middle, I would ask that you raise your hand, but please don't feel obliged to wait till the end if you'd like to chime in. Lisa, you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about where you work and the blockchain work?
Hello, everyone. My name is Lisa Butters, and I am the General Manager for Go Direct Trade, which is an online marketplace for aerospace parts, and it's powered by Honeywell. This morning, I was in a panel with Michael, and we talked about how we use blockchain technology, kind of like Carfax, to try to show as much information to the consumer about parts as possible. So I don't want to use that particular application. That's something that we do every day, and you can see it on Go Direct Trade and work today. But something that's really interesting to Honeywell, Honeywell is one of the biggest manufacturers of aerospace parts. We make everything from small components to engines that fly aircraft in the air. And one thing that we are aggressively exploring is how to apply blockchain technology to battle counterfeit activities on our aerospace parts in our supply chain. And so I think that's something that we could probably expound on. But kind of like the $100 bill has a 5-factor authentication process on it, we are trying to apply that same concept to aerospace parts and going deeper into the bill of materials.
I think we'll take your cue there. We'll dig into that deeper in a second.
Sure. Gary Singh from IBM. I'm the CTO for blockchain. I guess, from applications. I mean, we have some big ones that I won't repeat, on the supply chain side that we can get into. I think the interesting side on blockchain for us has been working with companies we don't traditionally work with, which is funny because I think a lot of people don't think of small companies coming to work with Big Blue. So I think the types of applications that we have been in the sort of asset space, but they've been everything from tickets, movie tickets, plays, that type of stuff to loyalty points, right? Which I think are all natural things. They kind of have some type of quote unquote token aspect. But I think the more intriguing part, right, was the fact that their journey to us, right, coming through the open source side with Hyperledger Fabric that we've been contributing to, and then wanted to move that along and bring that into production and starting to run that live. So I think those types of smaller use cases where folks are trying to disrupt markets, like the ticket side is trying to disrupt and disintermediate, to use cool buzzwords. Got to throw those in there for you. Ticketmaster, right? I think, for example, there's a lot of people who are small players out there who are tired of Ticketmaster taking the fees from them, right? So, for example, a bunch of playhouses and things like that people actually do attend a theater. They're like, hey, can we have another platform to do this? And the timing was actually right. And these guys are about to launch. You'll see plenty of press, I'm sure, from us. I can't say now, but on this. I think those have been the kind of most fulfilling use cases that we've been doing recently.
I love that example. Thank you, Marley.
Marley Gray with Microsoft. I'm the principal architect on it's a couple teams now, multi-party and blockchain engineering. And I've been doing this for quite some time. I can tell you projects that haven't done so well, but that's probably a topic for another scenario. But
you definitely feel free to tell us about your failures.
I can tell you how not to do certain things. I think everybody in the room probably can do that, though. I think the most interesting ones are the ones that are compelling use cases, and one of the ones I think about is on our Xbox platform is we have a royalties. When you have an ecosystem, and with Xbox is a large ecosystem, and we have game developers that they get paid royalties based on gameplay, and it means a lot to those companies to get that revenue and to make sure that they're actually getting what is due to them, and nothing is. Not being shortchanged, and also we're not overpaying. So it needs to be, and we have a solution for that. And it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? It was the thing that's like the aha moment when you say, oh, this could really solve this problem. But oh, by the way, it could also really help us with the general gaming licensing and the whole leasing of games, and this whole notion of, you don't buy a game anymore, you just buy a subscription. And how do you do royalties off subscription? You have to have that kind of backbone in place to be able to do that. So it really unlocks these new products that you really didn't think about until you have done things wrong a couple of times.
So a couple of those companies with the Xbox project are public, right? You can talk about. Is there one or two examples that you could mention by name and kind of talk us through how that relationship evolved? Just does Microsoft do outreach and say, hey, we've got this cool idea for a possible use case, why don't you come chat with us? Or are they coming to you and saying, we're tired of getting screwed over by big middleman X, Y, or Z, and can you help us prevent that from happening?
Yeah, we suffer from the problem of we don't have the luxury of going out and seeking for projects. They usually just we get the onslaught, and we have to like vet them very carefully. And that is one of the key things that you have to make sure you do. There's lots of projects that have big names attached to them that are a little more than the company picnic registration system that you really don't want to spend that much time doing.
It's like a picnic registration
the
system?
company picnic registration system.
I'm sorry, I don't know that term. What?
It's like the hello world of, it's a single party application.
Okay. Cool.
It's like they're not doing anything meaningful. Anywho.
Any examples there you want to mention by name?
No, God. No company shall be mentioned in this disclaimer. But the ones, if we look at sort of, internal at Microsoft, we have our own internal teams that run their own lines of business. They have their own P&Ls, and they will come to us, and we'll have casual. You have these conversations in the hallway. People will connect the dots, and so royalties sort of landed on our lap because they were. It's a very manual process, and this goes back into financial services as well. It will stagger people to understand how much of our financial infrastructure is run on Excel. It's very manual, and this was very similar. They were just doing these massive Excel spreadsheets, and the verification on those things was just looking for is there a duplicate of this key anywhere in this big, large file? To get that kind of stuff. And
what's the secret to making it through the great filter of Microsoft customers? You say there's an onslaught of demands.
Right.
I'm imagining 90% falling to the wayside. What's the secret to being one of those 10%?
The first is it has to truly be multi-party, right? A lot of them will come to us with a great use case, and they're the big gorilla in the industry, and they're wanting to use this as it's their hammer, and everybody else is a nail. And it's really not, and this is the toughest part, is getting a consortium identified, getting the dang thing off the ground has just been staggeringly difficult. It has nothing to do with technology, but that's been probably the hardest thing. But I think the technology doesn't lend itself well because establishing building the consortium is so hard. It's not something you want to just throw away, right?
And Gary, IBM's been really successful at the consortium building. Not to say that Microsoft hasn't also, but to turn the attention here, I absolutely adore the Ticketmaster use case and the local theaters that you mentioned. Perhaps some of you might not be surprised, but when I was younger, I was quite the Pearl Jam fan. And I remember Eddie Vedder hooting and hollering and raging against Ticketmaster and all the damage it was doing to the music industry and how they were just taxing artists in order to put food on the table. I love the idea of a consortium of local theaters. Am I reading too far into those words when you talk about local theaters?
No, I think I think the way that started was a bunch of folks had an idea, right? They had done work in the ticket industry for years. I think they looked at blockchain possibly not necessarily required, right, to solve things can be solved without blockchain technologies, but it looked like an innovative idea for them, right, in a way to kind of drum up some interest. And I think by going out and if you find players who have enough people who have a common interest, or I'm not trying to disparage a common foe. Right? I think that's a good way to
a common middleman.
A common middleman, right? To get them together, right? And then they're more willing to sort of share. And I think this company, but like other ones, right? That started out, you start out smaller, right? Not trying to necessarily boil the ocean, right? And I think sometimes people will say, there are detractors out there who will say, why is that project using blockchain today? That's just a central database or whatever. And I think sometimes for the way it starts, it might be, right? But I think when there's the vision that you're going to add, multiple parties, if you try to boil the ocean on day one and get everybody to join, I think sometimes we did ourselves a disservice sometimes, even from an IBM perspective. We would scare people on to talk about, yes, we do a great job building consortiums. We did stuff with, Walmart pushing, food trusts. We did work with Maris pushing, trade lands. We've done work with other folks, right? Because we have the technology and we have, the consulting services to kind of go see all these people. But then we kind of made it seem like how difficult it was. And yes, it is difficult, but then it also starts to put the barrier to entry and the people are just scared to come from it. Whereas I think if you actually want to start off, just say, hey, look, this is the way we want to go. We think there's going to be multiple people who are going to want to be validators and bring disintermediation and trust in here. But let's start out with a core group that actually is motivated to get things going, and then see where it goes from there. So I think that's what I really like about sometimes from the smaller projects, is it's just somebody starts with a grassroots idea and can actually get momentum sort of behind it.
How small is too small to get something started like that, where you might say, okay, come back in 6 months when you've got milestone A achieved?
I think, we used to always say, and I think there's a weird thing, and I'm not going to play like word games or whatever that are in here, but I think there are things of people who do like kind of distributed ledger, replicated ledgers, and there's people who want to be more on the kind of truer blockchain, like that's really, lots of members and things like that. I think if you're really going towards the sort of blockchain data going everywhere, obviously, you should at least have like 3 or more people that you're at least trying to deal with, I think, right? And there may be 3 or more departments inside a company too sometimes. I mean, believe it or not, we see a lot of people, one early thing was like a reconciliation ledger between people. And it was a good way for people to get their hands dirty with the technology, right? And at least learn it, right? My technical term would, before you poo-poo the technology, try it. Right, and that seemed like a sort of way to do it. So I think on those ones, and then I think on some of the smaller ones, it should definitely be, it may be that there's like 4 or 5 parties, and maybe there's only a few end lateral sort of agreements. But I think if there's at least multiple people who want to do that, then it becomes the common say. So I'd say, you should at least have 3, generally a vision towards 3 parties.
Lisa, I don't think that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Honeywell uses the consortium language when they talk about your network of users, but there is a similar process going on behind the scenes there. Can you just tell us a little bit about who is on the Honeywell solution, the GoDirect solution, as in like what kinds of companies, and how did you bring them together, if not by formally creating a consortium for airline parts?
Yeah, for aerospace, I would say that we're kind of in this infantile stage of figuring out blockchain technology and how it can really apply and be valuable to us as an industry. The way that we use it in GoDirect Trade, again, it's part pedigree data. We're trying to collect as much information about that part, not only from birth to death of the part, but deeper into the supply chain as well. And the types of players that are in our ecosystem, they range from being the OEM of the aircraft part to the aircraft dismantlers. So a lot of times
OEM.
Yep. OEM, original equipment manufacturer. Sorry.
Just in case.
Just in case.
Got to make sure no jargon.
Yeah. But aircraft dismantlers are the ones that when aircraft are retired, you cannibalize the entire aircraft. They are part of our ecosystem. We have 2 dismantlers that they continually dismantle aircraft and they feed that information into our ledger. Repair shops, something mentioned this morning was, yes, used aircraft parts go into lots of different airplanes. You guys are going to fly back, and I guarantee you part of that aircraft has lots of used parts inside of it. So repair shops are a big feeder into our ecosystem. Did they repair a part? Were they certified? And so right now there is no consortium, right? Honeywell is like this player that's trying to get the ecosystem going. You're a repair shop. Are you authentic? Do you have your certifications? Do you want to have a node, or do you just want to input your transactions using our API? These are things that we are just trying to win over these players one by one into our ecosystem so that we can try the technology, keep building it out. And then eventually, there's a lot of people in aerospace that are talking about a consortium, but I'm so sick of people talking about it. So, when people are going to figure out a consortium, that's great. But for us, we are just interested in working with partners and people that really want to get their hands wet and use the technology.
And so when we're talking about consortium members or supply chain participants, are we talking about something as so simultaneously simple and complicated as just finding somebody who's willing to run a node, or is that an oversimplification?
Well, so for us, we already have people who are interested in doing that, right? Creating their own node, inputting transactions in. But to me, a consortium, especially in aerospace, we have lots of different consortiums. Mm-hmm. Data exchange consortiums, lots of different groups. And to me, a consortium just means like red tape, governance, and slowness. And I just, for me, maybe we can figure out the consortium eventually, but I
Cool.
think it's more than that, definitely in aerospace.
Well,
if you're
so-
part of it, and membership fees, which I
think
don't like.
Those are very nice summaries of different analyses of how these networks can interact. I want to switch gears just a bit. During the break, since I last spoke with you, one of the audience members mentioned something about the airline industry not being able to buy parts across borders or buying parts from some countries. Is there a reluctance to use used parts from another country that something like this could help solve, or am I misunderstanding that?
Well, I think I'm not sure if it's really blockchain that could solve that. But for
Okay.
example, China, it's very hard to sell used parts into China and very hard to get parts that originated in China related to aircraft out of China. It's like in and out. The virus can come out, but for some reason, like we can't get aircraft parts in or out. So that to me, and I think that's a good question of can blockchain solve that? In my opinion, no. That's a government problem. Not a problem, but it's a government red tape thing. I'm just glad you bring that up because so many times we think, oh, well, blockchain can solve that, but it's either overkill or it really can't solve it. It's just not a very good use case for it, and in that case, no, it's not.
Opening it up here, how do you address that gray area between what the technology enables and what a regulator might allow or a government might allow? Where do you get involved in helping push the limits in that? Do you get involved in helping educate governments and regulators so that they might be more comfortable allowing things that might officially be in the gray area there? Or are you kind of waiting for them to come to those realizations on their own?
No, I mean, we spend lots of time just trying to help the overall industry and ecosystem have those conversations with regulators. We can't have conversations with every regulator, and our customers and our partners, and even, when we work together with IBM on things like the token taxonomy initiative was all about just, hey, we got to educate people and just everybody use the same words and same terms when we're talking about tokenization, and so we can be consistent and have one conversation with the regulator and not have 5 different ones. And the regulators don't want that, right? So there's a lot of work that we've done, and I'd say my last year was highly focused on just doing that.
Can we pull from the example that you gave of Xbox and gaming companies? And is there a regulatory body? Is there any oversight or no? Okay.
Not there. But we have lots of customers that are in financial services that are looking at, how do the SEC guidance is all over the place. I have these hedge funds screaming at me that want to do these things, and I'm a stodgy bank, and I can't do those things. How do I do these things? I can't even wrap my head around them. Not me, but I have non-technical people or even technical people that are like at the code level, but they can't wrap their head around the business concepts. So we had to create sort of a middle ground where everyone could come together and have those same terms and definitions and understanding. And
Drea, how does IBM navigate that space where you're going from what is technically possible and identifying real problems that the technology could theoretically actually solve, but because of some outside force, again, whether that's a regulator or a government body, et cetera, you are prohibited from doing that? What's the next step?
So I think there's been a couple of things like on the government side. I think several large companies have been in front of Congress at both like in the U.S. at both a state level, right? So there's several states that have been very pragmatic in their approaches towards blockchain. I mean Delaware, New Hampshire, a couple of other ones like come to mind, right? Trying to make themselves centers there. So I think doing some types of providing, typically at least companies are asked to come and present that point of view there. I think a lot of it, in some places, even internally in IBM, right, we'll have people who are, like Marley was saying, like, oh, this is a great technical idea. And then, I was mentioning this earlier, then people don't understand actually how I won't get on my soapbox, but they really don't understand how payments work, right? They don't understand the world that's in here. They don't understand the protections that we actually do have and that people actually do want, right, on that side. But on the other side, we learn a lot too, right? Because sometimes we don't actually understand, especially on a global scale, right? Because I think there's, working in like North America or the U.S. is a lot different than going to, say, Europe, where there's more ideas there to bring the EU together, other than Brexit, which wanted to bring it apart. But there's more things of moving data around. But then you have to understand things like GDPR. right? And then everyone's like, well, I can't remove it. Yeah, then don't put it on, right? Or actually start to, read the regulations there. So I think there's been both sides, right, where we've been, helping testify where we can in the bodies. I think bodies like the TTI try to bring together technology and industry, right? So we can define a set of here's what it means, here's the behaviors, and then you can get into small things like what it actually, we speak about regulation, but how many people, for example, everyone will say here, how many people actually know what Reg D, Reg S, what it actually means when you're actually doing a token or an STO, right? I mean, like simple rules, right? 99 accredited US investors, who knows what that, they're not even like that complicated, but I think, if you can get to an understanding of defining that, and then you start to see that, oh, well, the rules are all about on transfer. Here's what was allowed to happen, right? And here's the type of licenses you need to have to actually do this, right? You can't just, so I think you learn those things as well when you start talking across, all the geos, and you try to find a common set of denominators and say, how can we standardize this language, its vocabulary, and then translate it back to the actual regulators.
So one last question for everybody, and then we'll open it up to the audience. Emily, are we going to 250? Is that right? Okay, 40. All right. So really, this is a big question. But we have 15 minutes. Okay, cool. So higher level, a little more abstract. We'll get into a little socio-political stuff here. So we talked about perhaps some government and regulatory apprehension to the borderless world that is at least theoretically enabled by blockchain. And I think gave some good examples about why they might be reluctant to let that borderlessness happen. I think there's also been a reaction against borderlessness in the social sphere as well. And Gary, you mentioned specifically Brexit. As an Arizona native, proud MCC grad, where's the professor over there? All right. Half Mexican, grew up on one side of the wall that's being constructed. My dad lives on the other side of the wall that's being constructed. It's very personal for me that there's a literal barrier between these two countries, that the border is being constructed anew. And I think that there's some very, at least in my observations, there's some similarities between the building of that wall and Brexit, and a sort of reaction from people against borderlessness and fears of losing their identity or their culture or their language or their sovereignty, et cetera. When you look at the news and you see these stories and you kind of take in the current social political climate, do you see your work in blockchain fitting in that space in any capacity?
I think you kind of just explained the way that probably corporate America and these large companies look at blockchain in terms of we're so used to having a wall around our data, around our entity, and for us at Honeywell, this concept of blockchain is a whole paradigm shift. It's the removal of the wall and connecting to other enterprises and sharing our data, and not just being in it for ourselves and monetizing all the data because we can make all this money off of all the data, but it's sharing and collaborating and really treating it as a team sport. So your analogy to, feeling that, the border and it's us versus them, with blockchain, it really all goes away. And I think that's really why it's probably not as prevalent in corporate America, the technology, especially within aerospace, and it's because we're just so used to these walled garden approaches.
What's the climate you guys are seeing that you are building into?
Well, I mean, we're establishing a new basis of trust through trustlessness, which is really strange. But once you get your head around it, it does tear down barriers, and it provides the opportunity to tear down barriers. But we also have those pivots where we say, well, but I still need privacy, and I need performance, and I need these things. And that's what we've been struggling with over the last several years. It was pretty easy to tear the walls down, but then it was like, okay, I like not having walls, but I need to have a seatbelt.
Nice. I like that.
Because we're going to be driving really fast, and the airbag would be nice, and front and side airbags, and then, that kind of stuff. And that's what we've been largely working ourselves through. And it is tearing down these borders, and it removes friction, and when you have that ability to trust in the underlying infrastructure, frictionless transactions are way cheaper. So there's a financial incentive there as well.
Sure. When you're reading headlines nowadays, do you have any sort of personal reaction to some of the trends that you're seeing out there that you think might play into or not play into blockchain?
Yeah, I think, I agree with the comments before. I think, the interesting stuff out there, I guess, will be, more, I know we didn't want to sort of get into it, what actually does happen in the world of, whatever currency, digital currency, CBDCs, this type of stuff. I think on the one side, there's interesting stuff on technology helping, if you want to look on the social side of things, right, into areas, that people talk about, the unbanked and these types of areas, right? But there's lots of analogies to this. It's not like blockchain. It's kind of like, I used to live in Brazil a long time ago, right? And if you, and like, 1997, I had a Star Trek phone, right? We didn't have those in the US, right? Why? Because there was no POTS lines in Brazil. So the only way they could actually expand their technology at the time was they were going to go mobile. So they went all in on cellular, right, at the time, because they weren't going to put a POTS, plain old telephone system.
Thank you for that.
Oh, sorry.
Tip and ring, baby.
No jargon.
Yeah, I'm old. I'm old, but that's what they called it, POTS. Original acronym, plain old telephone system, right? I believe telephony system. But so I think you kind of see that, right? And when you start going into, so I think some of these combinations of mobile and 5G and mobile carriers and identity. So I think those things are interesting from the pure social side. It'd be good to see. I think bigger companies. I think we are kind of do some level of like social blockchain type stuff, right? That's not just for profit. So I think those pieces are pretty interesting there. To your other questions, I think on the whole borderless side of companies and things like that across the world, I think the one difference in blockchain now, I think from before was it was interesting. Everybody, and this is going to sound bad because we probably compete every year to get the most of them, and I get why people do it, but it's like patents in blockchain. It's like, and patenting a blockchain use case, really? Like, how do you do that, right? The whole idea of blockchain is that you're supposed to actually, and trust me, we have a few. I think I even have a few too. It's not my fault. Don't blame me. They give me money, so I needed to buy my wife a gift, so whatever. But but I think at least like putting those out there, right? Because people do have to sort of work together, right? And I think that now at least, like Marley said, right? It's more. Now, not that people they're willing to do it, then it comes down to what can we actually do? Whereas before it was like, well, this is my top secret idea. But you get the fact that the blockchain, you're supposed to work with somebody else.
Team sport, yeah.
It's a team sport. So if it's your top secret idea and nobody else knows about it, how are you ever going to, build people in? So I think we've, moved beyond that, right? Across.
Quick little anecdote to add on that, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I'm not sure if you saw it. I will plug the competition here. Cointelegraph, hi Rachel, recently did an awesome article about a BIS report that cited that of the 17 central banks that BIS surveyed that were working on central bank digital currencies, none of them were looking at cross-border payments. They were completely willing to leverage the benefits internally, but they were not looking to open up the world to a free market of competing currencies wherein you choose what you spend and the transaction can move across border seamlessly. That is not on the table. And I just think that's an interesting anecdote as to where we are right now and what's possible, but what's actually being pursued. On that note, thank you so much for the awesome thoughts there. I'd like to open it up to the audience. I think we have about 10 minutes here, so I hope we can get 3 or 4 good ones in there. Yes, sir. Hold on one sec. I think they're recording this, so I'm going to do the videographer a favor here and run over here.
This morning at the keynote panel, you were talking about your involvement with the climate accountability article. So I was wondering, I assume it's some kind of framework for transparency between corporations. And I would imagine that in doing that, you would have to have some kind of like bedrock of like what is, I was just curious how you're thinking about that.
Yeah. There is, so Hyperledger.org has a special interest group. It's climate action. If you're interested in joining it, you can. In that space, there's a ton of things going on. So it's not just about like measuring greenhouse gas emissions, but it's like the exchange of credits, standards and protocols. There's just a million different things. For Honeywell, why we're so interested in climate accounting is our basic use case is we have 1,000 facilities across the world. And for those 1,000 facilities, there's an average of 4 utility bills. And for each of those 4 utility bills, one person at each of those 1,000 places punches in the number in order to calculate what Honeywell's monthly and then yearly usage is for greenhouse gas. It's insane. It's so much manual entry, and we're just really trying to come up with one calculation at the end of the day. So that was our problem our problem statement. And we said, are there any startup companies doing this? Are there any big companies doing this, right? Trying to solve the problem of getting this information from the utility companies into one spot. And so far, I have yet to find anyone that's doing this in the world. And so one thing that we're looking at, Honeywell is in Arizona, is collaborating with the utility companies as a use case to say, hey, utility companies, would you be interested in starting to feed in your data into the ledger so that ultimately, if you did it for all of Arizona, all our utility companies, for all Arizona companies and households, you could calculate your greenhouse gas emission very easily. Honeywell's problem is that we're global, right? So every utility company in all the world would have to be on it, but we're still interested in doing this use case in Arizona because we have very few utility companies. It's semi-easy to do, and it really solves a big problem, right? I mean, can you imagine if utility companies start to feed in the basic utility data into the ledger, and you, at any given point in time, could calculate your greenhouse gas emissions?
Love it.
Yeah.
Awesome question, good answer. Who else has a question for us? All righty.
I was working with one of the utility companies actually in Northeast, doing the audit logging compared to what they have today on the customer data, and not the greenhouse gases, but at least going into the usability of each of them and trying to give them good vendors that are there, not the duplicate vendors who say and promise that there's $5 per unit and they charge $10 per unit later. It comes to the energy company to pay, the customers come to the energy company and say, your company screwed me up, actually. So if we are willing to collaborate on this, right? So what are your next steps on the greenhouse gases? So are you going to get the partners who are there involved in this, or?
Yeah, we are. So when it comes to Honeywell and aerospace, especially, even though that's the climate accounting thing, we are so eager to push the technology forward that we are very open to collaborations and vetting them out and working with other people. For the climate one, yeah, especially if you join the climate special interest group, you'll find a lot of like-minded people trying to solve various things, and you could probably find someone that's working on that particular use case that would want to work with you on that. In general, though, Honeywell is very open to collaborations.
Anything, let's get away from the energy accounting. Rob, go ahead and run this over to you.
Taking it to a fault. Yeah, and a separate thought came to me, and sorry to go backwards, to assign to each asset in your asset database a greenhouse index. So then you could basically say, I'm going to build the most greenhouse-friendly airplane and see if I can completely separate. The two of the major cloud vendors are represented in this panel, and both of you have kind of created managed blockchain capabilities in your cloud environment. And I'll ask it for Fabric, just because that's probably top of the list. But for all the others, it would be cool if you enabled deployment of nodes on other clouds. Is there any discussion or thoughts of actually collaborating? Because a big thing to a previous panel and a discussion about resiliency and the regulatory view of cloud lock-in, a big theme is interoperability, and the idea of being able to deploy nodes on different clouds answers that question completely.
So, well, I guess I would say it depends on the model. So I'm not here to advertise our stuff, but we do deploy on. I mean, from the software perspective of what we have, right? So yes, we are actually kind of interested in that. I think there's some complex agreements that have to be worked out between companies to make that part happen. But as an example, we actually are. So the stuff that we run today, the stuff that we run in our cloud, we have the same version of that as software. It actually runs on any Kubernetes environment, and as a matter of fact, in a couple of regions, we're running it on. We run it on AKS in a couple of places because believe it or not, IBM Cloud's not everywhere. I could not believe it, but it was not in every country. And we have a few people running it on AWS. Yeah, I think the overall market though of being able to say, could you? The more interesting side is like how the companies can kind of co-brand and things like that, right? I mean, just as they're mostly not technical, they all come down to like some logistic stuff. So I think we're definitely interested in pursuing that. I think if somebody wants to a bunch of people get together to champion that, I think that would really help, drive that forward because, some of it's like we could do it in IBM cloud, right? And I could push it and have you deploy it to AKS, but then you're paying IBM, and did you really want to pay IBM or did you want to pay AKS and Azure and just use our stuff? So those are more the logistic problems that we have. Technology-wise, I think we've been talking about doing this, and we definitely made, trust me, I made it, I run that team, so I made sure that our stuff would run anywhere.
Marley,
it definitely does.
I think the question was also addressed to you. If you'd like to answer, please do. If you'd like to answer,
There is no other cloud.
one slight modification, maybe just to
No.
add to it. Could you elaborate about, provide some details about how that would change your business model? Can that be done in a way that everybody is making money? Is there a way to do that? And could you give me some clear examples of that?
Yeah, well, first off, it's a primary. I mean, we hear that from all of our customers. I mean, it's like, hey, I need to make sure I can be multi-cloud. Now, sometimes it's just column fodder. I mean, just check
It's
the box.
what?
Column fodder.
Okay.
It's like in our opinion, yeah, just check it off, and they're not actually going to do it. But people do actually want to do it. They want to have. I heard one customer call it subpoena risk. So if somebody comes to subpoenas data, they can't just go to one cloud provider. They have to go to all three. Anywho, but no, we do have that as a primary requirement, and we've got infrastructure and teams. We worked out how do we make sure that we can connect nodes between Bluemix and Azure. AKS is Azure Kubernetes Service, in case you didn't know that acronym. And we've moved a lot of our stuff over to Kubernetes as well, because Kubernetes is sort of that. Once we move more and more infrastructure inside that Kubernetes, then you get the portability of being able to be multi-cloud. Now, the difficulty becomes management plan across all of those, and it's still doable, and you can do some of that in Kubernetes, but some of it at the fine-tuning at the node level that you might not, it becomes difficult because the networking stacks might limit it, and we have to build some infrastructure in place for every feature, bell, and whistle that you might want to tweak remotely from one cloud management to have it replicate across.
So,
that kind of stuff's not easy to do.
The question was addressed to the two companies, the two gentlemen who work at cloud providing companies. But Lisa, I can only imagine you might have something to chime in here from a totally different perspective as you're hearing this conversation. Do you have any sort of firsthand experience from your own execution?
So from this morning's panel, actually the guy next to me, Mike, had asked me, like, how involved does Honeywell get to try to get people just to do this thing, right? And funny enough, we had two partners that we installed a node on AWS and one on Azure. So we just because we wanted to prove out that it could run on multi-cloud, and we installed the nodes, we did even all the hardware. But I think it's just an example of how eager we are to just get people to start moving in this direction.
We're done. We're out of time. I could talk to y'all for another hour. I know that everyone has busy schedules, though, so I think we should probably go ahead and be respectful of everyone's schedule and call it an afternoon for now. But please, it sounded like there was some actual beginnings of conversations that really need to continue after this panel. So please go find each other. Please come find these folks here. Keep the conversation going, and give me exclusives later when you tell the story.